Air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as the blip on their radar screens continued flying straight ahead. October 21st, 2009. Northwest Airlines Flight 188 was supposed to be a routine evening flight from San Diego to Minneapolis. An Airbus A320 with 152 people on board, flying a route that thousands of aircraft complete safely every day. But as controllers in Denver tried to hand off the flight to the next sector, something unprecedented was happening in the cockpit. The pilots had stopped responding to radio calls entirely. For over an hour, Flight 188 became a ghost ship in the sky, flying on autopilot at 37,000 feet, with no contact with air traffic control, no response to emergency frequencies, and no acknowledgement that anything was wrong. The aircraft was heading directly toward one of America's busiest airports. But instead of beginning their descent for landing, the pilots flew right past Minneapolis at cruise altitude, disappearing into the night sky over Wisconsin. What the passengers didn't know was that their pilots had completely lost track of where they were, what time it was, and what they were supposed to be doing. This is the story of how two experienced airline pilots became so distracted that they forgot to fly their airplane, and nearly triggered a national security crisis in the process. The flight had started normally enough. Captain Timothy Cheney, 53 years old with over 18,000 flight hours, was in command. His first officer, Richard Cole, 54, had more than 13,000 hours of flight experience. Together, they were flying the second day of a 5-day trip sequence. Both pilots were well-rested and qualified on the Airbus A320. The weather was good, the aircraft was functioning perfectly, and the route from San Diego to Minneapolis was one they'd flown many times before. Flight 188 departed San Diego at about 4:59 p.m. Pacific Time, carrying 144 passengers and 5 crew members. The takeoff, climb, and initial cruise phases were completely normal. At 6:22 p.m., the aircraft leveled off at its final cruise altitude of 37,000 feet. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But what happened next would turn a routine flight into one of aviation's most bizarre incidents. As Flight 188 crossed into Denver Air Traffic Control airspace, controllers began the standard process of handing the aircraft off from sector to sector. Each controller would give the pilots a new radio frequency to contact the next controller down the line. At 6:45 p.m., the first Denver controller completed the handoff and directed Flight 188 to contact the next sector on frequency 134.12. 3412 Northwest 188, came the acknowledgement from the cockpit. That would be the last anyone heard from Flight 188 for the next hour and 17 minutes. The first officer had acknowledged the frequency change and read back the correct frequency, but then nothing. Unknown to air traffic control, the first officer had only partially completed the frequency change. To change frequencies on the Airbus A320, pilots must use a rotary dial to select the desired frequency, then push a button to activate it. The first officer had started dialing in the new frequency, but never finished the process. The aircraft was still transmitting on the old frequency, one that was no longer being monitored by any controller. But the timing of this simple error made everything worse. Just as the frequency change was supposed to happen, the captain had stepped out of the cockpit for a restroom break. Following security procedures, a flight attendant entered the cockpit to stay with the first officer. At the same time, dinner was being served. The cockpit was busier than usual, filled with distractions that pulled the first officer's attention away from completing the frequency change. When the captain returned, neither pilot realized they weren't talking to air traffic control anymore. Instead, they became absorbed in something that had nothing to do with flying the airplane. The recent merger between Northwest Airlines and Delta had created massive changes for pilots. The new crew scheduling system was confusing and complicated, affecting how pilots bid for their monthly schedules. The captain was frustrated. His November schedule hadn't turned out the way he expected, requiring him to commute to Minneapolis more often than before. "Let me show you how this new bidding system works," he said, pulling out his laptop computer. What started as a brief conversation quickly became an obsession. Both pilots opened their personal laptops and became completely engrossed in figuring out the new scheduling software. For over an hour, they sat side by side, heads down, staring at their computer screens. They weren't monitoring their radios. They weren't checking their flight progress. They weren't paying attention to anything happening outside the cockpit. The conversation monopolized their attention, as investigators later described it. The pilots had essentially stopped being pilots and became passengers in their own aircraft. Meanwhile, on the ground, air traffic controllers were becoming increasingly concerned. As Flight 188 entered each new control sector, controllers expected the pilots to check in on the assigned frequency. But the check-in calls never came. The third Denver controller tried repeatedly to contact the aircraft. Northwest 188, contact Denver Center frequency 127.02. No response. He tried again 21 seconds later. Still, nothing. As the flight passed through sector after sector without making contact, controllers began coordinating with each other. Something was obviously wrong. At 7:24 p.m., about 30 minutes after the last transmission, the Denver controller called Minneapolis Air Traffic Control to see if Flight 188 had checked in there. "Negative. We haven't heard from them," came the reply. Controllers began trying everything they could think of. They contacted Northwest Dispatch and asked them to send messages to the aircraft through ACARS, the digital communication system that displays text messages in the cockpit. They tried calling on the emergency frequency 121.5, the universal frequency that all aircraft monitor. They even asked other Northwest flights to try contacting Flight 188 on various frequencies. Nothing worked. On board the aircraft, the pilots were completely unaware that anyone was trying to reach them. Their laptops were positioned so they blocked parts of their instrument displays. Warning messages were flashing on their screens, but they didn't notice. The ACARS system was sending message after message. Contact ATC. A flashing green light indicated new messages were waiting. But the pilots were so focused on their computers that they missed every single alert. As Flight 188 approached Minneapolis, automated systems in the aircraft began displaying warnings that landing data hadn't been entered into the flight management computer. Enter desk data appeared on their displays. Decelerate flashed as the aircraft passed the normal descent point. LAT discount ahead warned that the autopilot was about to lose navigation guidance. The pilots saw none of it. At 8:01 p.m., as Flight 188 reached the final waypoint in its programmed route, the autopilot switched from navigation mode to heading mode. Instead of beginning an approach to Minneapolis, the aircraft continued flying straight ahead at 37,000 feet. They had just overflown their destination by 150 miles and were heading into the night sky over Wisconsin. In Minneapolis, air traffic controllers were now seriously alarmed. They contacted the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and the FBI. Fighter jets were being considered to intercept what might be a hijacked aircraft. At 8:12 p.m., Flight 188 made its first transmission in over an hour. But it wasn't to Minneapolis. The first officer had finally noticed something was wrong and attempted to contact air traffic control. But he accidentally tuned to a frequency for Winnipeg, Canada, nearly 400 miles away from where they actually were. "We have overflown our destination and need to turn around and head for Minneapolis," he radioed. The Winnipeg controller, confused about why an American airliner was contacting him, directed the pilots to the correct Minneapolis frequency. When Flight 188 finally re-established contact with Minneapolis at 8:14 p.m., the first words from the cockpit were stunning. "Roger, we got distracted and we've overflown Minneapolis. We're overhead Eau Claire and would like to make a 180 and do arrival from Eau Claire." Distracted for over an hour, while flying a commercial airliner with 152 people on board. The controller, probably still in disbelief, gave them radar vectors to turn around and begin the approach to Minneapolis. During the subsequent descent, controllers repeatedly asked what had caused the loss of communication. Each time, the pilots gave the same answer: cockpit distractions. But what exactly had distracted them so completely that they forgot to fly their airplane? When investigators interviewed the pilots after landing, the truth was almost unbelievable. Both pilots admitted they had been using their personal laptop computers during the flight, despite airline policy explicitly prohibiting personal electronic devices on the flight deck. The captain had pulled out his laptop to show the first officer his bid results for the November schedule. The first officer then got out his own laptop, and both pilots spent over an hour focused on the new crew scheduling system. They were so absorbed in the computers that they completely lost situational awareness. They missed radio calls, ignored warning messages, and failed to notice they had flown past their destination. The pilots allowed this conversation to monopolize their attention, investigators concluded, and thus lower their capacity to monitor their radio communications, notice the lack of contact, and recognize, via airplane instruments, the flight's progress. The laptops not only distracted them mentally, but also physically blocked their view of important cockpit displays. Warning messages that should have alerted them to problems went completely unnoticed. Both pilots insisted they never fell asleep. This wasn't a case of pilot fatigue. It was something potentially worse. They had chosen to stop paying attention to their primary job of flying the aircraft. The investigation revealed that the pilots had missed numerous alerts that should have warned them something was wrong. 9 ACARS messages from dispatch, asking them to contact air traffic control. Multiple warnings on their flight management system displays. Alerts that they were approaching Minneapolis without landing data entered. Warnings that they had passed the top of descent point. The complete loss of radio contact for over an hour. Any one of these should have been enough to get their attention. Missing all of them was unprecedented. The most chilling discovery was what happened when the aircraft reached the end of its programmed flight path. The autopilot, having run out of navigation instructions, simply continued flying straight ahead on the last assigned heading. If the pilots hadn't eventually noticed their mistake, Flight 188 would have continued flying northeast until it ran out of fuel somewhere over Canada. The incident created a brief national security scare. When military officials couldn't contact the aircraft, they began considering scrambling fighter jets to intercept what might be a hijacked airliner. The timing was particularly sensitive, coming just 8 years after 9/11. An unresponsive commercial aircraft flying over major metropolitan areas with no radio contact triggered emergency protocols designed to prevent another terrorist attack. Fortunately, the pilots re-established contact before military intervention became necessary. But the incident highlighted serious gaps in aviation security and pilot training. Flight 188 finally landed in Minneapolis at 9:14 p.m., about 1 hour and 18 minutes late. The 152 passengers had no idea how close they had come to a much more serious situation. As the aircraft arrived at the gate, both pilots were met by airport police and administered breathalyzer tests. The results were negative. They hadn't been drinking. They were also tested for drugs. Again, all tests came back negative. The investigation concluded that the pilots had simply become so distracted by non-operational activities that they completely forgot they were flying an airplane. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable cause was The flight crew's failure to monitor the airplane's radio and instruments and the progress of the flight after becoming distracted by conversations and activities unrelated to the operation of the flight. Both pilots were immediately suspended and later had their airline transport pilot licenses revoked by the FAA. Their careers were over. The incident led to significant changes in airline policies and procedures. Northwest, which was in the process of merging with Delta, immediately banned all personal electronic devices from cockpits during flight. The FAA implemented new rules requiring airlines to develop fatigue risk management programs and policies addressing pilot professionalism. Air traffic control procedures were updated to ensure better coordination when aircraft become unresponsive. The aviation industry was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Even experienced, well-trained pilots could become so distracted that they essentially stopped flying their aircraft. The Flight 188 incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of distraction in the cockpit. It demonstrated how quickly situational awareness could be lost when pilots focused on anything other than their primary job. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the pilots hadn't been dealing with any emergency or mechanical problem. They had simply chosen to prioritize personal business over the safety of their passengers. For over an hour, 152 people were essentially flying in an unmanned aircraft at 37,000 feet, while their pilots played with computers in the cockpit. The incident remains one of the most bizarre cases of pilot error in commercial aviation history. It showed that sometimes the greatest threat to flight safety isn't mechanical failure or bad weather. It's pilots who forget they're supposed to be flying the airplane. Flight 188 landed safely, and everyone went home to their families. But the incident served as a stark reminder that vigilance and professionalism in the cockpit can never be taken for granted. In aviation, distraction isn't just unprofessional. It can be deadly, and on October 21, 2009, 152 people came far closer to disaster than they ever knew.